Oh, hey, how's it going? This is Dr. Pete Mamick, and welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. This is the second lecture in our God unit, and in this lecture called Theism, we're going to be focusing on more arguments for the existence of God. And in this class, we're going to be talking about 5 arguments altogether in favor of the existence of God. So here's the 5 arguments listed out. The first 2 arguments we discussed in the previous lecture, lecture 16, the trademark argument of Rene Descartes, and the ontological argument from Saint Anselm of Canterbury. The 3 arguments that we're going to be looking at here today in lecture 17 are the cosmological argument. This is also known as the first cause argument. You might think of this argument as an argument whose main topic has to do with like the whole cosmos, the whole universe. Where did it come from? How did it come to be? Was there a first cause? And if so, wouldn't that be God? Then we're going to look at an argument called the design argument. The design argument is the argument that's in the background whenever there's a discussion about whether evolution, especially the theory of evolution as put forward by Charles Darwin, whether that is sufficient to account for certain aspects of the natural world, especially those aspects having to do with the biological world, and whether instead we need to appeal to something called an intelligent designer. So if you know anything at all about biology, about how like human bodies or the bodies of animals work, it's amazing. It is amazing the amount of complexity that is involved in a properly functioning living organism. And when you look at other parts of the natural world, you see like piles of rocks and clouds of dust, and the living things really stand out in contrast to the non-living things, the things that are like just rocks and bodies of water and clouds of gas. There's just so much order and organization. And if you compare these living organisms to machines, as it's kind of natural to do, because both the living organisms and the machines have parts, you might be led to the belief that just like the machines needed a designer, an intelligent designer, to get all the matter organized and working properly, so would these living organisms. And allegedly, uh, so goes the argument, the natural processes posited by, say, Darwin and other advocates of that Darwinian evolutionary theory of the origin of biological species, that's just not good enough. It doesn't account for what we need to account for. So there's an appeal to God. So anyway, the design argument is the argument that's in the background of discussions about, for example, whether you should teach evolution in school, or whether evolution should be taught alongside a religious-based argument that says that God made all the puppies and kitty cats. And then finally, there's an argument known as Pascal's wager, which is a kind of interesting argument for believing in God. It doesn't directly argue for the existence of God, but it says that you would be a good bet. Like if you want to maximize your happiness, it would be better to make yourself believe in God. Um, so it doesn't argue directly for God's existence. It argues for the practical superiority of believing in God. All right, so let's take these in turn, starting with the cosmological argument, aka the first cause argument. So here's a little diagram that shows a bunch of different events, each of which is, at least in most cases, a cause of some other event, which is in turn a cause of some other event. And then we've got this infinity symbol. You might think that maybe this is a good representation of everything. Everything is a thing that came from something else, right? But wait a minute. if it's true that everything came from something else, then there can't have been a first cause. There can't have been an uncaused cause, right? If everything came from something else, even this thing would have come from something else, but then it wouldn't be uncaused, right? Um, so you might think then that maybe most things come from other things. Most events are effects of causes, which themselves are effects of causes. But if you go back far enough, you're going to find some event which is a cause but is not itself caused. And maybe that's God. That's the gist of this argument. Let's take this a little bit more slowly and just start with a question. What do you think of this question? It's a yes or no question. Would you answer yes or would you answer no? Is each and everything that exists caused by some other thing? Yes or no? Well, it's got to be one or the other. Either the answer is yes or the answer is no. That's known as the principle of bivalence. Suppose you say yes, that everything is caused by some other thing. Well, that would lead to one of two scenarios. Either it would lead to an infinite chain of earlier causes. But wait a minute, isn't that absurd? An infinite chain of earlier causes? Or maybe what it does is it leads to a circle of causes, but that's absurd also. And you might say, wait, what? Go slower, Mandic. Okay, I'll go more slowly. So the question is it true of each and everything that exists that it is caused by some other thing? Well, let's suppose that the answer is yes. What would that be like? Well, one version of what that would be like is that you've got a finite number of causes, but they are related to each other in a loop. So here's a very simple example. There's just three events: the red one, the blue one, and the green one. The green one is the cause of the red one is the cause of the blue one, and the blue one is the cause of the green one. Now, here is a universe that is very simple. It just has three events in it: A, B, and C, green, red, and blue. Green causes red, red causes blue, blue causes green. Wouldn't this be a universe in which each and everything is caused by some other thing? So here's a thing, green. Is it caused by some other thing? Yeah, blue. Here's a thing, blue. Is it caused by some other thing? Yes, red. And here's a thing, red. It is caused by some other thing, which is green. So each and everything in this universe is caused by some other thing. But this would be a situation in which there is looped causation. And further, if you think causes have to come earlier than their effects, in order to have this kind of looped causation, you would have to have looped time. That's the topology of time that we called circular or looped. And we've talked about that a few times now in earlier lectures. You might think this is just absurd. It's absurd to have later events cause earlier events. It's absurd to have a circle of causes. But if it's true that each and everything is caused by some other thing, and there's only a finite number of things, then it would have to be some kind of a loop. You might say, well, it can't be this loop. This loop is absurd. We need something linear. Well, if it's linear, then it can't be finite. It would have to be infinite. For each and everything, if there's some earlier thing that is the cause of it, then that's basically a chain of causes. A chain of events, each of which is earlier than the one before, and each of which is itself caused by some earlier event. But that would stretch on into the past infinitely, and that's absurd also. What's absurd about that? Well, in order for there to be this infinite chain of causes, there would have to be an infinite chain of past events. And if there's an infinite chain of past events, then how would we get to the present moment? You're like, what do you mean, how would we get to the present moment? Well, let me ask you this. How long would it take to get to the present moment? Assuming that there's an infinite amount of past, how long does it take to get to the present? It takes an infinite amount of time. But that is the same as something that never happens, something that takes an infinite amount of time. Suppose I painted the wall, and you asked me how long is it going to take to dry, and I said, well, it's going to take an infinite amount of time to dry. Well, that's the same as it's never going to dry. If it takes an infinite amount of time to dry, then that is paint that is never going to dry. If you need an infinite number of moments to go by before you get to the present moment, then that's just something that you're never going to get to. You're never going to get to the present moment. But obviously, we've gotten to the present moment. So, says the argument, there can't be an infinite chain of events. There can't be an infinitely long past. And so, therefore, there can't be an infinitely long set of causes. So, if each and everything is caused by some other thing, then either you've got an infinite linear thing, or you've got a finite circular thing. And both of these things lead to absurdity. So therefore, we need something that is not absurd. What would be something that's not absurd? Well, it would be something that is finite, like this one, but linear, like this one. You would have a chain that has an earliest link. That's what gets you out of this absurdity. So it's false, then, that everything is caused by some other thing. There has to be, then, at least one thing which is a cause without itself being caused. That's the first cause, or the uncaused cause, or the unmoved mover. That's most of the argument. There's just one more thing that we have to add, and that is, therefore, God exists. Therefore, the first cause is God, God himself. So, we could summarize that argument, the cosmological argument, otherwise known as the first cause argument, like this. Premise 1, at least some things are caused by other things. Premise 2, there can be neither a circle of causes nor an infinite chain of earlier causes. Premise 3, there must then be a first cause, and then we get the conclusion that therefore God exists. You might say, like, well, that's not great. I mean, it was pretty good up until around here. Like, yeah, maybe there has to be a first cause, but like, that's not such a great argument for the existence of God. Why not? Well, just because there's a first cause doesn't mean that that is God. Think about, for example, our definition of God, or our definitions of God from the previous unit. So one of the definitions of God was the one about how God is all loving and all knowing and all powerful. There's no information in this argument that would tell you, there's nothing in the premises that would tell you that the first cause has to be all loving, or that the first cause has to be all knowing. There's nothing here that tells you that the first cause would have to be an infinitely perfect being, or a being greater than which none greater can be conceived. So there's none of those three definitions of God that would make it follow from the existence of a first cause to the existence of God. So there's this big gap between this third premise and the ultimate conclusion. That really is the main killer objection to the first cause argument. So if anybody asks you, can you think of any objections to the cosmological argument, you should tell them, yeah, I've got one. Why does the first cause have to be smart? Why couldn't the first cause just be some blind, idiotic mechanical process? Why couldn't the first cause just be the Big Bang? So many of you have heard this theory from physics that there was a Big Bang at the very beginning of the universe. All the matter and energy just like appeared and exploded, and it's been expanding outward ever since. You might say, yeah, well, where did the matter and energy come from? Didn't it have to come from something else? Well, wait a minute, hold on a second. Are you saying that everything has to come from something else? If so, then you're committed to an infinite chain or a loop, but you have good reasons for thinking there can't be an infinite chain. So then doesn't there just have to be a first cause? You might say, yeah, okay, sure, there has to be a first cause. Well, why couldn't the first cause just be a Big Bang? Why does the first cause have to be a holy person, the most holy, good, beautiful, wonderful, worship-deserving person that God is supposed to be? Why couldn't it just be this period of inflation coming after a bunch of quantum fluctuations? Why couldn't that be the first cause? Why not? Why does it have to be God? the cosmological argument by itself doesn't give you God. At best, it gives you a first cause. Well, let's look at a different argument. The design argument, also known as the teleological argument for the existence of God. Teleology is a word that we mentioned a little bit back when we were talking about virtue ethics, and we were talking about the virtue ethics of Aristotle, and the idea of telos. Everything that has a telos is something that has a purpose. Having a telos is having something that you tend toward. And we illustrated the idea of having a purpose or having a function in terms of this quote from Aristotle that said, if the eye were an animal, then sight would be its soul. The purpose of an eye is to see, and that's its function. When it's functioning properly, it is granting sight. And we could say this about other bodily organs. So when a heart is functioning properly, it is pumping blood. That is its purpose, or its telos. When we look in nature, especially biological nature, when we look at the plants and the animals, we look at the bodies of people, when we look at the smallest structures in living cells, we see an enormous amount of telos, an enormous amount of teleology. We see an enormous amount of purpose. There are various things, structures, processes that are serving purposes. There are little structures inside of your cell that serve the purpose of eliminating waste, and other structures inside the cell that serve the purpose of converting fuel into energy. There are structures in your body that are serving the purpose of preventing you from being burned by ultraviolet radiation from the sun, and other aspects are preventing you from getting overheated. Other aspects are preventing you from catching a disease that would kill you. So there's all these different things that serve purposes. But now let's think of somewhere else that we observe purposes. One person who's described the design argument is someone named Paley or Pally, and they give this example. Imagine you're walking on a beach and you see in the sand on the beach, you see a wristwatch. Wouldn't you be aware of the fact that this is something that somehow came from an intelligent designer? You wouldn't believe that the wristwatch just like popped into being from a bunch of sand swirling around, like the waves in the sand. They swirled around in such a way that it made a wristwatch. You could see that there has to have been some intelligent process, some intelligent designer that designed this thing, and then workers, I guess, who, following the blueprints of the designer, built the thing. But in examining a machine, you can conclude pretty easily that it's an artifact, that it's artificial, that there has to have been somebody who came up with the purpose in their mind and they built it to fulfill that purpose. And how do you know that a watch is such a thing? That a watch is not the sort of thing that could just pop up at random. When you look at other parts of the beach, you're walking along the beach and you see like some puddles and you see some like swirls, sand swirling in the water. You see rocks that are washed up on the beach. You see the waves crashing into the shore. Now, all of that stuff is kind of random. Like the bubbles on the waves go this way versus that way. It seems like that could just be random. And there's nothing about it that impresses you that someone had to make the bubbles. There had to be an intelligent person that made the bubbles go this way versus that way. There had to be some intelligent designer that made the waves crash on the beach at this moment versus that moment. It's easy for you to see that the way in which the rocks are washed up on the sand is just kind of random. But the watch stands out as something that is not random. It's something that has an order to it. There's all these different parts fulfilling all sorts of different purposes, and they indicate their origin had to be grounded in intelligence. Now, if that's true for a watch, shouldn't it be even more true for a flower or a baby or a kitten or a puppy dog? Like, if you look at those things, if you look at living organisms, you see way more parts than you see in a watch. And you see way more organization. You see way more complexity. all sorts of like tiny little pieces. You know, this flower is made out of thousands and thousands and thousands of cells. This watch is made out of like 100 parts, tops. Thousands and thousands of cells, each of which are themselves made out of thousands of parts. And each one of those teeny weeny, tiny little parts are all working together in a just exquisite way. Yeah, sometimes a flower will get diseased, a living organism will get sick and die, but mostly like they live. You think about how many human beings are alive today. They haven't died. I mean, they're going to die eventually, but they're not dead yet. There's 7 billion people alive right now on the face of the planet Earth, and their bodies are filled with cells that are functioning to keep them alive. That is amazing. That is absolutely amazing that there's that much coordinated effort amongst trillions and trillions and trillions of cells to keep life on Earth living. How could that be? If the watch had to have been designed, then didn't the flower have to be designed? Isn't there an intelligent designer that made the whole universe, that made the sun and the earth and the moon and the stars, and so therefore doesn't God exist? So here's the argument summarized. The design argument, otherwise known as the teleological argument. Premise 1, artifacts, that's like watches, wristwatches. Artifacts have parts that work together to serve a purpose, and they got this purpose from their intelligent designers. 2, nature has parts that work together to serve purposes. So, for example, like a whole ecosystem is made out of organisms that work together as parts to serve various purposes to keep the ecosystem itself alive. An organism has parts that work together to serve purposes of keeping the organism alive. Organs, like the heart or the eye, they have parts that work together to serve the purpose of the organ. So nature has parts that work together to serve purposes. By analogy, says the third premise, by analogy, nature itself must have come from an intelligent designer. Therefore, God exists. Now, if someone asks you, are there any objections to this argument? There's a couple places that it should occur to you that you could raise objections. One is you might think that this argument by analogy is actually pretty weak. So that seems like not a terrible line of reasoning, but it's not the strongest line of reasoning. So yes, okay, these two things are similar in this one way. Does it follow necessarily that they're similar in another way? So suppose that you didn't know anything about birds or bees. You're from Mars or something like that, and you're like, oh yeah, tell me about the birds and the bees, Mandic. And I said, well, birds fly, and they fly because they have wings. And you're like, okay, all right. And I say, bees fly, and they fly because they have wings. And you're like, okay, all right. And then I say, birds' wings have feathers. And then you're like, hold on, Mandic. By analogy, bees' wings have feathers. Because birds and bees both fly, and birds and bees both have wings, and birds' wings have feathers. Therefore, bees' wings have feathers? Is that a good argument? You might say, well, I mean, that's somewhat reasonable. That's kind of a reasonable conclusion to come to, but it's not like the strongest reasoning you could come up with, because you've just proven something that's false. And that's not very good. It's not a good argument if you've proven something that's false. We know that bees' wings don't have feathers. So that helps us see that this argument by analogy about the birds and the bees is actually not a very strong argument. And it kind of points out the weakness in all arguments by analogy. All arguments by analogy are kind of like not great. So yeah, it's true that artifacts have parts that work together to serve purposes, and further, those purposes were obtained by their intelligent designers. Does it follow by necessity that nature has to have had an intelligent designer? No, it doesn't. Maybe there's some other way you could get parts working together with purposes other than intelligent designers. But here's another problem with the argument. Suppose it's true that there has to have been an intelligent designer. Why does it follow then that the intelligent designer is God? Isn't it possible that the intelligent designer was just some alien, or maybe the intelligent designer was Satan? Or maybe the intelligent designer was just like I don't know, something intelligent enough to get the job done. But if we look at the definitions of God, um, right, they say things like God is all perfect or God is all loving. There's no information in here about intelligence and design and purposes and parts that would prove that the intelligent designer would have to be all knowing or all powerful or all loving or infinite. None of that would follow. And if that is part of the definition of God, then it doesn't follow then that the intelligent designer would have to be God. The intelligent designer might as well just be the Dark Lord, Satan. Okay, let's look at one more argument. Well, it's an argument for the existence of God, kind of. It's kind of an argument for the existence of God, but it also is kind of like a weird way of getting there around the side, making an end run around the whole, like, can you prove the existence of God thing. So Pascal's wager we can think of in terms of a bet. We're going to do some betting. And when you are betting, when you're thinking about making an investment or betting or playing the lottery or whatever like that, you have to think about like what you stand to win and what you stand to lose. So, you buy a lottery ticket, it costs you $5. And if you lose, then you're out $5. But if you win, you're going to get $5 million. Now, some of you might buy one lottery ticket every week. You might say, like, $5 a week, that's not a big deal to me. And it would be totally worth it. It would be totally worth it, even if there's only 1 in 1 million chance that in your whole life you're ever going to get that $5 million. It still might be worth it to you. And if we change the numbers, you might have a different opinion. Suppose the lottery ticket cost $5,000, and the payoff was only $6,000. Would you buy a ticket every week that costs $5,000 for the chance of winning $6,000? In fact, would you buy it even once? You'd be like, well, what are the odds, man, Dick? So let's say you had a 1 in 10 chance of winning. Would you spend $5,000 to win $6,000 if you had only 1 in 10 chance of winning? What if it was 50-50? What if I said, give me $5,000 and let's flip a coin. If it comes up heads, I will give you $6,000. Would you do that? Some people would, some people wouldn't. So anyway, when you think about betting, you have to think about things like, what's the likelihood of the various outcomes? How big of a cost is there going to be to play? How big of a cost is there going to be if you lose? And how big of a winning are you going to get if you win? Okay, now let's put this kind of thinking in terms of stuff that has to do with God. So, by the way, this is going to come up again later. When Pascal thinks about this stuff, he thinks about God from a particular, specifically Christian point of view, and that's something that we might raise as an objection. Like maybe God does exist, but it's not like the Christian God. But anyway, Pascal takes this kind of like roughly Christian sort of conception whereby the God that we're talking about is the sort of God that if you believe in that God and the God exists, then you get to go to heaven. And if that God exists and you don't believe in God, then you're going to go to hell. And right, so this is a particular version of Christianity where, like, there's heaven and hell, and what gets you to heaven is belief, and what gets you to hell is disbelief. You might say, yeah, but wait a minute. Maybe the atheists are right. There is no God. Well, what happens if the atheists are right and you believe in God? What's going to happen? Well, nothing. It's not going to be infinitely good, but it's not going to be infinitely bad either. So let's spell this all out in terms of this diagram that we have here. This is the payoff matrix for Pascal's wager. So either you believe in God, that is, you become a theist, or you don't believe in God, you are an atheist. And we might say atheism and agnosticism fit here because they both withhold belief in God. If God exists and God requires your belief in him to go to heaven and otherwise is going to send you to hell, well, then the atheist and the agnostic are both going to hell because they both don't believe in God. So, suppose you believe in God and you are right that God does exist, then what do you get? You get a lot of happiness, you get a lot of pleasure. How much? An infinite amount. You get eternal joy. That's a big payoff. That is a big payoff. And now, what if you're wrong? What do you get? Well, you might say you don't get anything. If you believe in God and God doesn't exist, well, what happens when you die? What happens when you die is there's nothing. You don't experience anything. You're just dead meat. That's not so bad. I mean, there are worse things than experiencing nothing. There is, for example, eternal torment in hell. Um, but anyways, so if you believe in God and God does exist, then you get an infinite positive reward. And then if you believe in God and God doesn't exist, then you just get zero, which you might say is neutral. It's neither bad nor good. It's just right in between. It's zero. Now, suppose instead you're an atheist and you choose atheism. You decide not to believe in God. And suppose you're right. What do you get? What do you get for that? Okay, atheist. What do you get for being an atheist? Well, I mean, for a few years, I guess you could, have fun doing atheist things, going to atheist parties. But like pretty soon, you're going to be dead, and then you're going to spend the rest of the eternity being dead. And what do you get during that is nothing. It's just nothing. It's neutral. But what if you're wrong? If you're an atheist and you're wrong to disbelieve in God, then what do you get? Well, you get an infinity of torture in hell. Okay, so what are you supposed to do? Well, if this is the right way of spelling out your possibilities, it seems pretty obvious. Being an atheist and being right, and being a theist and being wrong, they both result in just a neutral outcome. But being a theist and getting it right gives you not only a positive outcome, but an infinite positive outcome. Like, wow, that's a lot of positivity, an infinite amount. And if you're an atheist and you're wrong, then, oh, you're going to hell. It's going to be terrible. It's going to be terrible forever. So what should you do? You should decide to believe that God exists, because if God really does exist, you get an infinite amount of pleasure. And if you're wrong, then nothing to worry about. You're just dead. You're just dead. After you die, there's no life after death. There's just no experience. It's neutral. But it's way riskier to be an atheist. If you're an atheist, like, well, maybe you're right. Whoop-de-doo. So you're going to die and just be dead meat. And if you're wrong, you're going to hell, buddy. So that's the Pascal's wager argument. And you might say, like, well, that doesn't prove that God exists. It just proves that if God existed, it would be better off if you believed in him. It doesn't prove that God exists. So it's a weird sort of thing. Like, believe in what? Well, believe that he exists. So it's arguing that you should believe that God exists. But it's not arguing that God exists. There's a slight difference between whether you should believe that God exists and whether God does exist. It is saying that believing that God exists is going to maximize your chances of experiencing joy, assuming that God exists, and also assuming that the Christian picture of God is the correct one. However, one of the many objections that you might think of against Pascal's wager argument is like, well, why even start off with the Christian conception? Like, aren't you just supposed to go into this completely neutral about all the religions? Pascal's wager doesn't really give you any guidance then. So maybe it's the Christian God, or maybe it's the Judaic conception of God, or Muslim conception of God, or maybe it's some like one of the the many gods you get in a polytheistic religion like Hinduism, or ancient Greek polytheism, ancient Roman polytheism. Um, what kind of like so? Yeah, if one of these is right, then believing in it maybe would give you some reward. But how do you even pick? It just seems like a mess. And it would be easy if you could start off by assuming that the right way to think about God would be the Christian one. But you can't assume that. This is supposed to be an argument for that, not something that would allow you to assume that. Um, and then another objection that you might make against Pascal's wager is that it seems like Pascal's wager is assuming you could just decide to believe something. That's that is a philosophical view known as voluntarism, that you can freely choose what you believe in, but that's really questionable whether that's possible. Um, so suppose you walked into a room and you saw me holding this hammer, you would probably believe that this was a hammer. And now suppose I told you, like, okay, I will pay you $1 million if you believe that this is a flower. Would you be able to get yourself to believe that this is a flower? Like, I mean, you look at it and you're like, well, it looks like a hammer. I believe that it's a hammer. I'm like, well, okay, make it look like a flower. Make yourself believe that it's a flower. Some people are going to say, I'm sorry, I can't do this. They appreciate they cannot make themselves believe something. They believe that this is a hammer, and they can pretend like they believe it's a flower. They could say, oh, what a pretty flower. But that's not going to get you the $5 million. Pretending is not good enough. You have to actually believe that it's a flower. And I think a lot of people are going to appreciate at this point that you can't really just will yourself to have different beliefs. That whatever beliefs you have, they come to you regardless of what you will. Now, other people might say, no, maybe you can change your beliefs on purpose. So, suppose you were an atheist, but all your friends were theists, and they seem like really happy people, and so you start to do things to try to get yourself to change your mind. You don't hang out with your atheist friends anymore. You only hang out with the theist friends, and you go to all their theist parties and you listen to all their theist discussions. And one thing that happens to a lot of people is just by hanging out with other people, you kind of like change your mind. Um, so. Or you might hire somebody to like suppose you really you love cigarettes. You just love cigarettes. You think cigarettes are the best thing in the world. You believe that cigarettes are the best thing in the world, except for one thing. You also believe that it would be better for your health to not think that. You're trying to quit smoking, and you want to quit liking cigarettes. Wouldn't it be easier to quit smoking if you just got yourself to not like cigarettes at all? So you hire someone to follow you around and just tell you like several times every hour, hey, cigarettes suck. I hate cigarettes. And you might even hire a whole team of people and they just like say terrible things about cigarettes whenever you're around. Would that be a strategy for getting yourself to change your mind? Like on purpose, get yourself to change your mind? So anyway, it's a very difficult topic, like the topic of whether you can just decide to believe something. A lot of people are going to say, no, they can't. They can't just decide to believe something. I believe there's a guitar behind me, and I can't just make myself believe there's not a guitar behind me. I mean, I could like light it on fire and make it not be a guitar anymore, and then I wouldn't believe there's a guitar. But like, just look, like if I believe there's a guitar in front of me, and without touching the guitar or changing anything about the external world, just like using my force of will directly on my mind, I can't make myself have a different belief. At least that's how it seems to me, and maybe that's how it seems to you as well. Okay, so we have discussed in the previous lecture plus this one 5 arguments for the existence of God, and then in this lecture we looked at these last 3, 4, and 5. Let's wrap it all up now and talk about study questions. Study question number 1. One objection to the cosmological argument is that just because a first cause exists, it doesn't follow that the first cause is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving. What would you say the answer is? That true or is that false? Study question 2. According to the cosmological argument, A, God must be perfectly good. B, God is neither uncaused nor self-caused. C, everything is caused by something prior in the causal chain. D, there is a first cause. E, both C and D. What do you think the right answer is? Well, I'll tell you what the right answers are. The right answer to question number 1 is A, and the right answer to question 2 is D, and that brings us to the end of lecture 17. Okay, well, thanks for watching that video, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.